Hey, I'm Nick. Welcome to the Family Ministry Podcast. This is episode 284, and I'm going to talk with Brian Aaby about an article that he wrote recently called Where Have All the High Schoolers Gone? So, if your student ministry has had lower numbers, specifically in high school, but even overall, you're going to want to listen to this podcast. Maybe they haven't. Maybe your student ministry has actually done well in terms of attendance, but you're going to want to listen either way because we talk about some key things that teenagers are facing, especially through the pandemic, how that's showing up now, 2, 3 years later, things like that. So we're going to jump into that in just a little bit. Brian is a search associate with the Slingshot Group. The Slingshot Group is an organization that helps churches find and hire great staff. They provide coaching, helping staff teams develop culture. I started working with the Slingshot Group on the side. I still work at my church about a year and a half ago. So I've been helping churches find and hire staff. And so we talked to Brian about his experience now, seeing plenty of high school ministries in decline, and then how lead pastors are responding to that, how we should respond to it, because sometimes we're not responding well because of the numbers. And then we also talk a little bit about search, like what should churches be thinking about when they're hiring somebody? What are some mistakes they make? Brian has done this for a long time. So as I joined the Slingshot team, I definitely look to him for help and guidance and wisdom. And so we kind of ask him some questions about that as well. Now, before we jump into this episode, I want you to check out ClearStream, which is a text message solution for churches. It's what we use at my church. It's a mass text message solution. You can use it to send, text everybody in the church to remind them about something that's coming up that weekend. You can send it to specific groups. You can have keywords that people can text in to opt in to different groups. We use it for new guest follow-up, recruiting volunteers, student ministry communication, children's ministry, partnering with parents in so many different ways. So check out nickblevins.com/text to check out ClearStream. And then if you haven't got my new book, The Volunteer Playbook, yet, I'd encourage you to check it out. Go to volunteerplaybook.com. From there, you can link to buy the book, but you can also get the free resources that come with the book. Even if you didn't buy the book, you could actually get those free resources. So check that out at volunteerplaybook.com. But let's jump in now to my conversation with Brian Aaby about where have all the high schoolers gone. Today we have Brian Aaby on the podcast. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, good to see you, Nick.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about you, your family, and the work you do with Slingshot. And most people, if they've listened to the podcast, probably know I started helping with Slingshot a year ago. I guess it's a year and a half ago now. But you've been doing this for a while, even before Slingshot. So tell us about you, your work,
Yeah,
before Slingshot. Give us kind of the picture there.
the 30,000-foot flyover of Brian Aaby. Yeah, raised. I'm out in the Seattle area, born and raised here. Did a lot of years of youth ministry as a youth pastor. Started my own org in 2008 that did short-term mission trips. We branded something called Mission 51, which was training for the 51 weeks of life outside of the mission trip. That kind of put me more on the regional map and even the national map. As Youth Mart grew, I started speaking for an organization called Youth Specialties, at their national convention, but also part of their team training across the U.S. One of their the leaders for the YS Core, that type of stuff. So that was definitely more on the national map. And I had this side hustle, Nick, of helping churches. I was always a networker. Loved hanging out with other youth pastors, grabbing pizza, that type of stuff. And networking was kind of the core of who I was. I liked being outside my own setting. And Mark Matlock was the president at YS at the time, and he saw just on my social media that I was doing this thing called transitional consulting. I had no idea that Slingshot, Vanderbloom, and the others even existed. Had I known that, I probably would have charged a little bit more for my searches. But I was just doing side hustle work with churches, helping their volunteer teams in the time of transition. So I'd have a pastor call and say, "Hey, Toby left. Can you help us with our with our search or with our team?" And so I'd come in and help train up their volunteers for sustained youth ministry while they were doing a search. And the pastors were saying, "Well, your network, a lot of people. Can you help us?" So I was smart enough to charge for it, just not smart enough to charge enough. And Mark saw that and asked, just as a team member at YS, he said, "Hey, any chance we can get you to come aboard and do this with us?" And so I started Youth Specialties search and coaching back in 2013. Was with YS for 5 years, and then in 2018, when YS was going through a leadership change and ownership change, that's when Slingshot and I talked. We had Slingshot doing a worship search for us at my church, and so I was in relationship with one of the consultants at Slingshot, and that just started the conversation. And David Miller, who was the main student ministry guy at the time at Slingshot, he and I were kind of friendly competitors in the field, and we were friends, and yet in competition. And it was just kind of a really good on ramp with Slingshot. So I've been with Slingshot since YS in 2018. So 2018 to now, 5 years later with Slingshot, I'm at I think 109 or 110 now searches with Slingshot. So it's been a whirlwind. Serve as senior associate of Next Gen. So Nick, you and I are on the same team, along with 15 others.
Yeah.
With doing the Next Gen searches. I do a little bit with senior leadership, coaching and cohorts, and doing some consulting as well. So that's kind of the work path. At home, married to Elizabeth, 26, almost, well, no, yeah, 27 years now. Man, I need to keep track of these things.
Don't you? Yeah,
20,
yeah.
20,
I told somebody the other day that my wife and I have been married 17. It's 18 years.
yeah,
And I just
yep,
later is like, oh yeah, another year went by.
yep,
Oops.
yep. So 27 years. We have a 21-year-old daughter, Hallie. She is a senior at ASU Online. She's a Starbucks barista, so she gets to go to school for free through their online program. And then Audrey is at Grand Canyon University, going into her sophomore year there. And then Will is going to be a sophomore in high school here locally in Seattle. And yeah, love the fam life. We do a lot of Mariners games. Baseball fans. Will is a baseball player, so on select and travel ball, and so that consumes a lot of our weekends during the summer.
Oh yeah, I bet.
So,
Yeah.
yep, there you
Does he
go.
play year
That's
round? Does he play year round too? Because of
they
the
do.
travel
This
thing?
is
Yeah.
this is their 1 month off right now. Like
Yeah.
literally, they just finished their last tournament last weekend. Time of the shooting, I guess. Late July, early August. They take August off besides lifting, and then
Yeah.
give their arms kind of a day a break for a month too. And then it's a long month for Will, like, because he is baseball junkie, like truly
That's
a
funny.
junkie.
That's fun. Now, how many you've done 109 searches for Slingshot? I remember we just celebrated when you hit 100. On our
Yeah.
team we celebrated that. How many did you do for YS? And is it 10 years total now doing this? Or more?
Yeah, I've been doing this for about 10 years, maybe even a little bit longer with a couple of the independent contracts that I've done. I would guess that I'm in the 160 to 175 range. I'd have to go back and look at my records of YS, but probably 50-ish there, and probably another 10 independent, I'd guess.
That's
a lot,
man. That's
a lot.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna bounce back to that because I wanted to talk about a little bit of church staffing and search and the landscape. And obviously, I'm in that world too. But you're the veteran, and you've done it for so long, and you do it more. Like, you're doing more searches than a lot of our associates. But the big reason we wanted to talk is you brought up this conversation with our team that you're hearing a lot of youth ministries and that are in decline, youth ministers that are struggling, leaders of youth pastors who are upset with their youth pastor that because the ministry is struggling. And so you wrote a great blog post on the Slingshot blog, which we'll link to in the post in the show notes. But tell us kind of the premise of that article, what you have been hearing and what you've been learning.
Yeah, I mean, the calls aren't foreign to us, Nick, that we're getting, an angry executive pastor or concerned senior pastor, or whatever the premise is for them calling, and just saying, man, our high school or our middle school, whatever. So I've received these calls for years. I would say the frequency of that call has definitely stepped up, especially in, I would say, 21, 22, and 23. And it's increased more, I would say, in 22 and now 23. 2020, obviously, COVID affected all of us. On the Slingshot side, you weren't a part of the team at that point, but the first 3 months, we moved to beyond full-time consultants. As people were shutting down, they're wanting to know, how do we shut down? How do we transition to online? And then as soon as the South and Midwest either was in denial that COVID even existed or whatever, they opened up, it was I'm in Seattle, so this is left coast, truly left coast. And everyone thought I was crazy because I started traveling because churches were losing youth pastors, or next gen pastors or family pastors, and I was needing to come in and start doing the search. March of 21 and then April of 22, I think I have those dates right, were both kind of seen as the great resignations, not just across church, but across all industries. Both those months were the two biggest months of mass resignations. And so like everybody was losing work. You go to any restaurant and it's now hiring signs are up, and bus drivers, and we have to travel for our job, Nick, and so you see like longer delays getting picked up for your rental car because they just have less shuttles going, all that type
Mm-hmm.
of stuff. Well, in the church world, we've had these mass resignations, and as you've already alluded to, we have more job openings than we have candidates available, and so you see like the way that it's shifted. Well, where we're seeing the practical stuff happening in the youth ministry world, because people have left, you have less qualified people even coming into some of these jobs. So I have churches calling me where they have a fresh new hire, and yet still that executive pastor is calling and saying like, but we're still seeing a decline in our group, like maybe this isn't the right fit, and it's reliant upon a person. So I just, because of the frequency of these calls, I just started thinking about, I was like, what could be the contributing factor? Our kids, literally high schoolers, is what they're complaining about. Especially, we're seeing an increase in a lot of places in middle school attendance. We're seeing an increase in church attendance, or at least a return to old numbers pre-pandemic. But high school ministries as a whole, and there's definitely exceptions to this rule, but as a whole, we're seeing a decline in high school ministries. So the premise of the article, and just doing some research on my own, comes down to this: that the second most formative time in the building of the brain, the second most formative time in any of our lives is between the ages of 11 and 14. 0 to 2 is the most. That's when the most neuropaths are being created. And then you fast forward to when people are 11 to 14 years old. That's the second most formative time in that adolescent, preteen to teen mindset, our mind build, I should say. And you fast forward, or you think about it in more like reverse, not fast forward, but 3 years ago, um, our 14 to 17-year-olds now, who are high school age, 3 years ago is when the pandemic hit. And so they were in that 11 to 14-year-old range. And so when their second most formative time of their brain is happening, those neuropaths are being built. They are at social distance, they're masked, there's political divide, there's racial divide, and parents needing to make choices. They're away from their classmates, they're not in their sports, and now you have this dilemma of what's happened to our high schoolers. From the adult perspective, Nick, like I'm a parent of a 21-year-old, 19-year-old, and 15-year-old. I remember what youth ministry looked like in 2018, 2019, and early 2020. I know that my daughter was in AP classes, she was attending youth group, she was in choir, she had all these extracurricular activities. So for her as a 21-year-old, her life hasn't been affected nearly as much as now my 15-year-old, who went through the pandemic in that 11 to 14-year-old stage, and now as a 15 to 17-year-old or 14 to 17-year-old, um, we're basically saying like, hey, get back to life as normal. Well, it's never been normal for that 14 to 17-year-old. In the time where they were socially distanced and masked and all those divides, their neuropaths were being built. And so in the blog, and I'll let you talk because I know I'm talking for a long time now. In the blog, I give the example of, I was part of the Northridge earthquake in the 90s, or 1990, I think is when it happened. Martin Luther King Day down in Northridge, California, and literally the freeway collapsed on each other and roadways were wiped out. And so you got all this LA traffic now experiencing blockages and rerouting. Well, that's what's taking place in a teenager's brain, is that their freeway system was built between age 11 and 14, and now we're saying take a different route. It's gonna take time for those neuropaths to be rerouted, and socially, they're not adapting the way that we think that they should. We're forcing something on them. So it has ramifications to like attendance, to participation, all that type of stuff. So ask questions, because I've been blabbering for a while here.
No, that's good. That's good. And you also point in the article the difference between like adults, like the fraction of our life that was COVID,
Yeah.
versus the fraction of their life being a larger percent, and then the fact that it was a formative part in their brains and not a formative part necessarily
Yes.
in ours. So it is easy to just miss that, right? You probably have lead pastors that you want to say, hey, you need to give a little grace to student
Yes.
ministry now, because your student pastor and you don't even understand what it was like to be a teenager then, to be a high schooler now, and
Correct.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Which they
Yeah.
probably
I
don't
mean,
want to
you and
hear
I.
that, right? I mean, that is. Have you said that to any of them? Have you tried to say it
Oh,
softly, like?
yeah. It's a both and. I try to say it softly. You try to like. I like thinking in metaphors. You know, if you got somebody who has been a weightlifter before, and like took a few months off, of course you have muscles atrophy and stuff like that. But it's easier for them to resume,
Mm-hmm.
and get back to that muscle mass and stuff like that because their body has done that before. And so like that's the senior pastor, that's the executive pastor, that's us as veteran next gen people. Well, you take somebody who's never weightlifted before, it takes a lot longer to build that mass up, than just 2 months to recover. It's like
Mm-hmm.
they're starting from scratch. Well, our 14 to 17-year-olds are starting from scratch in many ways socially, and we're throwing them into large group settings and big camp and overnighters and stuff, and you're seeing them vote with their feet, not showing up because of social anxieties, because of depression, because of things that they've gone through that we didn't go through, because our brains have already had those neuropaths created, they haven't.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I've seen the stats too, just about like adults that are lonelier. And I think this was already like heading that way anyway. But like COVID event men, I think like the number of close friends.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen that survey or that piece of data a bunch of times. Like the number of close friends adults have. So it makes sense that students would be in there too. I remember it's a silly thing, but and my kids are young, 10, 7, and 4. But I remember during COVID, so they were even younger than that. My oldest, I was thankful that he could get on our iPad and FaceTime with friends and play games, which normally is not the thing that you'd be thankful for that your kid's doing, spending time. But when he's, not outside, like, and it's different than even like how we grew up. I just spent so much more time outside in the neighborhood with friends that I had a group there too.
Mm-hmm.
And my son doesn't really have that here where we live, a little bit, but not much. Most of his friends are through school, sports, and church,
Mm-hmm.
and all of that was on hold for a
Yeah.
while and came back at different times. And so that was a small thing where I was glad that they were staying connected and talking, and so it's easy to miss out on that as a teenager. And then this is real, like in the weeds. It's in some ways it's part of my story. I didn't go to middle school ministry when I was in middle school because I
Mm-hmm.
just was shy and didn't want to go. I did it. I went on Sunday mornings. I think I was there Wednesday night, whatever that was. But student ministry was a different thing. I didn't feel like I knew anybody, and I never went. And then finally got invited by my youth pastor. He literally came to my house. It was one of those deals. You take some students with you and to go do visits.
Yep.
And I was actually across the street at a friend's house, and he invited me, and I started going, and in high school, and I look back and I regret that I didn't go in middle school. But my point is, it's already hard. Like even before COVID, you'll get students that don't want to come because they're just nervous, they're shy, they don't have a connection, they
Mm-hmm.
don't have friends. It's awkward. That's probably just 5x now. Like that's probably part of the issue is those neural pathways are this way. I'd rather be alone, more
Mm-hmm.
comfortable to be alone and isolated, even though it's not good for me. And so to get me to go, it's almost like parents are gonna have to push even harder. Like there's part of me that wishes my mom had made me go, as a middle
Mm.
schooler, and that's hard as a
Yeah.
parent. You want them
Yep.
to choose it is what you want. So I can see
Correct.
this showing up that way. That's one reason why the attendance isn't there, and you just don't snap that back. You just don't
Correct.
have one good event and now they're all coming.
We've got to build a longer on ramp. We've got to adjust programming. Like overall, like again, it's not a one step fix, but it's like figuring out like, hey, let's have a couple more options, like smaller group options for students. And I think that the blog says this. The days of it's not even the days of like the all nighter and lock-ins and stuff won't work. It's more a matter of how do we build them back towards that. It's working in middle school for as a whole already, like the big group
Mm-hmm.
events, the camps and things like that, still are working, especially with the middle school level. But high school, they're more drawn to like the cafe and the coffee shop and somebody's living room than they are to the lock-in and to the large group experience, just because that there's a social intimidation that they're not ready for. So it's the building in, scaling your ministry through your volunteers, being present at their track meet and choir concerts and stuff like that, doing something in that smaller, showing up at your house and inviting you along.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to return to some of that personal and relational side of things. But unfortunately, church elders and church senior pastors and executive pastors, again, coming back to your point that you made, like this was 1/25th of their life. For a teen,
Mm-hmm.
this was 1/7 or 8th of their life. And so we don't, as the older person, have the mindset of like, why won't this work? It's always worked in youth ministry, and we measure butts and seats. And so attendance, I've been saying this for a few years, we got to stop measuring attendance the same way that we do for church. We see church attendance, 400 people in our church service. We can measure that. But like for a student pastor, youth ministry has shifted. And so like, rather than measuring butts and seats at our Wednesday night, what if we were to actually measure, like we had 8 in meeting for that morning Bible study on Tuesday morning with that one leader, because they're athletes, they can't show up on Wednesday night. And then on Friday, we do this afternoon cafe thing where another 9 students are showing up for that don't come on Wednesday because it doesn't work for them. Well, you might actually see an increase in attendance overall because we're meeting them at different places and different, avenues and venues than just the typical youth group night. So that's the diversifying. And if a church is just oriented around it towards butts and seats at their one prime ministry meeting, I think that we're going to see a lot more youth pastors get fired for the wrong reasons.
Yeah. I think one thing that, because there are some exceptions where some high school ministries have done well, but you're right, it's they're outliers. And I feel like, and I don't know, this is just my sense of it. Part of me feels like one is they probably had a really good small group foundation, and there's a difference between like having student small groups and having like really good ones where you probably built that over. It takes a long time to build. That's not a 2-year thing. And the leaders showed up, and then that way there was still like that relational connection through COVID, and especially if you kept at it somehow, like leaders were reaching out, like if you were good about that, making calls. I think that's part of it. And then I do think you're right, like the reaching out to them in different ways, making it more relational. I think that has helped with some ministries, but there's a challenge there because there was a conversation I was having with other leaders in this space before about student ministry and challenges there and drop-offs, and everybody talks about like the model needs to change, and I'm all for that because I like change, but I haven't seen a new model work yet. And the one thing we were talking about though was it used to be that you could get them all to your thing, and then if you, it'd be really good if you could show up randomly in their lives, like think small group leaders going to games or whatever, small group leaders doing their own activities outside church. That's great. That alone is huge. It almost does feel like though the next need is showing up randomly in other areas, like in all areas of their life. Like you're going to catch them more there than you are in your main thing at your church. But the problem is that would take a lot of time. Like, not especially for a youth pastor, but especially even their volunteers. How do 20 volunteers show up in the lives of, I don't know, 80 students or something like that, if that was your ministry, all of them randomly? Like we can all point to small group leaders who do a good job showing up at their group's things, but that's not every group leader, and that's not every kid. And so I don't know. It's tough because it's almost like we live in a world where now you can have, it's all your choice, your smorgasbord. It's a buffet. You can get it quick. And I worry that, and in some ways I feel like that's what's needed in the student world, because you can reach kids different ways, the way you're talking about. You reach them in the large group and them at the coffee shop and they're at the house group and they're part of this serving thing, which I do think is part of the answer. I just don't know how in the world a youth pastor pulls that off. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think part of it's a mindset change of literally the attendance, the idol of attendance, that we think we're oriented around a number rather than oriented around the growth of that person. Because what does it look like if the church is effectively discipling a parent because they're coming to church on Sunday, because they're involved in a small group, because dad is actively or mom is actively or both are actively pursuing Jesus and God's word? Well, they are effective. Hopefully they're effective in discipling their own teen and preteen. And so you're growing that person, whether they attend your youth group or not. Shouldn't the goal be spiritual growth that overflows into the lives of those that don't know Jesus yet? But instead, we're looking at program growth and program attendance rather than actually remembering, why does that program exist? That program exists because we want to see people find and follow Jesus. I think that we've forgotten about that. We're like, no, we're hiring a program director so that we can increase our attendance, so that we can increase our giving, so that we can afford that very person that we hired to do that. So we've lost focus.
Yeah. And I do think, again, it's harder because everybody needs more volunteers. So most youth leaders are thinking, I don't even have enough small group leaders or whatever leaders that I need, period. But I do wonder too if part of it'll be it'll be a little separate. Where like those volunteers are the ones that have that thing at their house that students are invited to, and they reach a certain group, and these leaders are part of the core program that happens here, and they lead a small group, and these leaders are part of a serving thing, and some students do that, and then like you're saying, the picture of health is who's involved somehow, not who's
Mm-hmm.
involved in the one. We see
Yep.
that with our trips, like our summer trips for students. Like our fall retreat's always been really good. That's probably our big thing. And then our summer trips, I would say in some ways I don't know if maybe they did reach a peak, like where it was like this is really good, but not much. Or even if they did, not both middle school and high school. And then I think, and COVID had more of an impact on that, especially with, I don't know if other people see this, but how late people sign up for them, which is just kind of funny.
Totally.
But the one thing my student pastor and I have talked about is, and we just wrapped the last trip of the summer. Let's look when this is all done, how many students went to a trip, because there were
Mm-hmm.
technically 2 options for middle school, 3 for high school, and our goal isn't you do all the things, but so let's make sure we look how many went to one, and even though
Mm-hmm.
every one of them wasn't probably what it had been in the past, even though our student ministry is larger, I bet if once we look and we see how many participated in something, we're gonna be like, that's really good, like that
Yeah.
and it was good for them, and it's not even about the number, but good for them, or even serving. I just there are other. It's like you're saying. I think there's other ways that we got to connect with them. But I think my favorite takeaway from the article, other than just the facts about brain development and the tips that you have in there about practical steps, is like smaller community, which
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. It's my youth pastor showing up with one of my friends. That was the other key. He had one of my friends
Yeah.
with him, and my friend was going to be going. And so I think that's good. Any last
Yeah.
thoughts on that before I want to pick your brain a little bit about church search and what we do at Slingshot and some things you're seeing there?
And no, I mean, just along the lines of, I mean, obviously invite anybody to read the article, and if they want to follow up with me with any specific questions, happy to answer, as well.
Cool. Well, I want to talk a little bit about church staff searches. I mean, this is what you've
Yeah.
done for 10 years plus. It's what I'm doing now for the last year and a half, and I've certainly learned a lot along the way. I was asking you questions like week 2 on the job because you were the veteran, and I'd love to ask how would you describe the landscape of church staffing search right now in Next Gen specifically? This is a
Mm-hmm.
conversation we have a lot among the Slingshot staff.
Yeah.
Where's it changing? What are we seeing now versus, I don't know, a year or 2 years ago? And I know, like, when I came on, it was like, I think you all grew 50% in 2021. So it went from like
Yep.
COVID, where a lot is not happening, to like 2021, people are leaving. Now that the whole organization grows 50%, a lot
Yeah.
of people working a lot of hours. Where is it now? Like, what do you think when you when
Yeah.
you're talking to churches? How do you describe it?
Somebody asked me that, executive pastor asked that the other day on a sales call, potential search, and I said, what, today's Tuesday? Okay, it's this today, but tomorrow will be something different. It's literally like, it's not quite that dramatic, but I would say about every 3 months right now, we're seeing like an increase of candidates, and then a decrease of candidates, an increase of candidates, and decrease of candidates. And then even also like the quality of those candidates that we're seeing. And it stinks because all of our churches essentially are consumers. And so the way that they consume has not changed since the pandemic. And that's what needs to change, is that they have to understand mass amounts of people have left ministry, which means the backfill has been a church, let's just say an average, not average, because an average church is like 100, but let's say an average church that's using us, Slingshot, is probably between 800 and 1,500. So it's a larger, medium to larger size church that is affording a search. Let's say they used us prior to the pandemic, and they're used to that 3 to 4 month search and getting that kids pastor or student pastor. Their expectation is exactly the same, even though the landscape has completely changed. The minor leagues have depleted, essentially, using a baseball analogy, Cooperstown.
Yeah.
So the reality is that 800,000 person church that's hiring a student pastor, they had a 32-year-old leave the position, and last time they got him when he was 28 years old. And so now they come in with that same expectation of, we want that 28-year-old. Well, that 28-year-old is now, quote unquote, qualified. They've got 5 years experience. They're not looking at that church of 800 to 1,200 anymore, because they can get that church at 2,000 or 2,500 or 4,000, because so many people have left. They are now, even though they don't have as much experience, they are now qualified for a different role than they would have been had we not gone through the mass resignations. So the average church, Nick, this is exactly, if you've done, you've done several student pastor searches as well. The average student pastor search, when I go and do the site visit, the church is saying, we want somebody that's 28 to 32. We want somebody who's married, preferably with kids. We want somebody that has their master's degree, or at least is partly through their master's degree. We want their spouse to be involved in ministry. And so they literally are naming, like, not just a unicorn, but a purple unicorn at that. Unicorns don't exist, so obviously a purple unicorn really does. And it's those specific things. And so the mindset change that I hope that they would have is two things. One, change their expectations. Understand that we're going to get somebody probably with less experience, that there's going to be a longer on-ramp for them. And the other one would be, start building your own minor leagues. Like, we've got to do a better job. The reason we exist as Slingshot, I hope I don't get in trouble with our bosses, but the reason we exist is ultimately because of the failure of the church. The church not building up and discipling from within so that we can hire from within when somebody moves on. So like residencies and apprenticeships and everything like that, man, I just think that we need to do a better job of raising from within. Like the thing that's most life-giving to me at Slingshot is consulting and coaching. Like, I love that. I love developing somebody in their own context the most. And I stay pretty busy with it. But the reality is, like, that pales in comparison to the amount of people that are coming to us for a search. People are coming to us for a search because they lost somebody and they don't have anybody from within. What if less were coming to us because they have a need for replacement? But what if they were coming to us because they want enhancement of their minor league system within their own church?
Yeah, which is, in the long run, is so much better. It's like another sports. I'm a football guy, not a baseball guy. So I think of like the draft versus free agency. You have free agency to fill the holes where the draft messed up. Like, you picked two players that didn't work out, or you didn't develop them well. So then you're paying more money, in free agency than you would in the draft. And it does work. That's how you can help make your team better and filling holes. And probably the best churches are doing both, right? They got the bench they're building up and hiring from within. And then you come to us when you want a different kind of hire from the outside, someone that's not internal, or you just want a different culture. You want like a culture change and things like that. But one thing I've said to churches when I talk about like how it is harder now and takes longer is, I feel like I've learned this from you all, and then from experience with it, but it feels like it's so many things in one, because it is like people that left, so there's just less on that end. Ministry schools and colleges are experiencing much lower enrollment, so the early end of the pipeline isn't as big. And then people don't move as much. Our team has talked about that. Like, I get so many, I'll go to Nashville or Houston, and what they mean is like where I live or where my family is. You know what I mean? Like, it's not even. One of our associates, I was telling, I see all the time in there people that just want to be in Southern California. Like, and it's so funny because, which I get. I mean, if you live there and you probably don't want to sell your house, you probably couldn't afford your own house if you sold your house. So I get that. But regional and then pay, because of that, I guess the demand is going up. Some churches, they can make more money. And so like all those factors in one, and it's like more demand, less supply, right?
Yep.
With some of these leaders.
100%.
What, last question here, what would you say to some churches? Like, what mistakes did churches make when hiring staff, even with the help of us at Slingshot? In that process, you've been through this so many times, and maybe this is the thing you wouldn't say right to them to be nice on the call, but now you can say it here, and they can hear it before they do a search or something like that.
Yeah. Man, you hear this, and I know that you've probably heard this phrase too. Like, well, man, we just need the rock star youth pastor. We just need the rock star kids pastor. Like, what does that mean? Like, literally, you want somebody who like can play the guitar to be your, no, of course not. They're just looking for that person that is a very special unicorn, that like, man, we expect them to be present in the students' lives. We expect them to be great with the leaders. We expect them to be great teacher, great communicator, and be administratively gifted, get those receipts in on time. I still struggle with that. And the reality is, like, what I love to say to them is like, man, let's find somebody who is gifted in some specific areas and let them excel at those gifts and surround them with people that cover their weaknesses. Instead, we're looking for this complete person that doesn't have struggles. Well, we all do. We all have backsides. We all have shadows. We all have areas that we're not all that strong at. And so changing kind of that expectation. They make mistakes in that they go after the person who's a great communicator, somebody who's going to be great from the platform, but has no structure or backbone. To me, like I look at I think what's the most important is work ethic and teachability. Somebody who wants to learn and wants to work hard to learn. That's far more important. I think we can teach somebody to be a better teacher. It doesn't mean that they're going to be the 9 or 10 that you were looking for, but what if they're a 6 right now, but they're really, really good at pouring into leaders and scaling the ministry and really present in the lives of teens? They may not be the greatest teacher, but they're going to be seen as an 8 or 9 because of the relationship that they have. In student ministry, and Nick, you're way more of an expert than I am in the kids ministry area, but in student ministry, I see it as 3-pronged. It's student, it's leader, and it's parent. Like if you have those 3 aspects of the stool and you have a strategy around all 3 of those things, you're already steps ahead, because most youth pastors get into youth ministry because of the relationship with teens. And they then go, oh, I can't do it myself. I need to build a team. So I get some volunteers, and they usually are going after that young adult volunteer because like they're young and hip, and they have no relationship with parents because they see it as adversarial rather than advocate. And so if we can change that mindset to like, we're advocates, like you are the expert in teenagedom as a youth pastor, they are the expert in their teen. So we should actually have a partnership with parents more so. So I look for those things. Rather than just that rock star great speaker, somebody who's got woo, like on StrengthsFinder, woo is like, I think one of the most dangerous things, because you can easily get through the front door with woo, but if you don't have some of those other strengths, like you're going to be a flash in the pan. Like that's just going to be, so like somebody who does have woo, like yes, lead with it, but make sure that you're letting them know you have structure behind. Because personality-driven youth groups and personality-driven kids ministry are not sustainable. Building into that base of parents and leaders is what will sustain.
I wanted to ask you about one of the mistakes that I've heard and I've seen a little bit, very little bit, is like I hear churches will, we present candidates, they get that first set of candidates. Somebody in there is really good, but because it's the first candidate presented or one of the first 3 or 5, you're waiting for better. And then it could happen that 8 months later, you've still never seen somebody as good as one. Does that happen a lot? Is it like not that common? How do you see it?
Yeah, I would say it happens probably on the majority of my searches. I really try to pour into say it's an executive pastor, into the executive pastor to say, do not compare candidate to candidate. You got to compare candidate to the job description. If you and keep them in the race as long as they still favorably compare to the job description. Now, the reality is that they are consumer, and so they are like, if we're going to 3 different burger joints, all 3 of them may be satisfactory, but we do have a favorite, and it's like, so they put that person up on a pedestal, and that becomes now the measuring stick, and so they want to be a consumer, they want to see other ones. So it's like we gave them candidate A, B, and C. They move forward with A because they were the best. They liked C, and B was like, not a theological fit. They like C, and if it was just C, they probably would have moved forward. But because A was so good, A becomes a standard. They actually start campaigning against C in their mind. And then A takes a job somewhere else. We're starting the search over. Because even though C was good and they could have like figured out like, hey, what areas is he or she kind of weak? Do we have somebody that can kind of help complete that? And yes, speaking to yours, like specifically that question of like, yeah, because they're consumers, they just wonder like, we're paying Slingshot a lot of money. There's got to be others. And it's like, we don't have like a back 40 lot where we're just growing trees with kids pastors and youth pastors. It's like, we're dependent upon people in a specific season of their life that they're wondering, is there something different out there? Do we happen to cross paths with them, or do they happen to see our website? More and more of my searches, it's me reaching out to people and wondering like, hey, are you interested? Way more than just people seeing our jobs and going like, oh, I want that. So
yeah, it's almost like, I mean, I've probably said this before, and I don't know if our bosses are listening, if it's okay, but I feel like you pay for the process and the network and the work. You don't really pay for the candidate because it's not a guarantee. It's not like, you didn't just create them. And so you're paying for the process, the network, and the work. hoping that it gives you a better shot, which I think it does. And we use Slingshot 3 times at my church before I ever worked
Yeah.
there. So it definitely gave us a lot better shot, but
Yeah.
nothing's guaranteed. All right. Well, only a couple minutes left. How can people connect with you? You are leading and you regularly like different coaching groups, cohorts through
Hmm.
Slingshot for next gen leaders. You got a couple coming up. Tell us about those.
Yeah, love to, man. Yeah, specifically, like even talking about kind of the candidate pool and the I don't want to use the word minor leagues because it sounds like people that would come to cohorts would be lesser. Like no, like again, the young, hungry, or not even young and hungry, older and hungry. I have people that are 40 plus in cohorts and some that are in 20. I love the fact that it is truly that like First Corinthians 12 principle, one body, many parts. The iron sharpened iron aspect of cohorts literally like them in a nutshell. 6 month experience bookended by 2 retreats. So like our next gen cohort starts in Seattle, ends in Orlando. 6 months of online zooms on a monthly basis, and then a one-on-one with me each as well. But the group bonds, gets to know each other. They do peer-to-peer stuff. The one-on-one coaching is phenomenal. So I have next gen cohort, and then I also have a next gen advanced, somebody who's been through coaching, whether it's through me, another Slingshot associate, maybe even outside of Slingshot, but can kind of make their case of like, hey, I think this advanced is more for me for these reasons. I've got that one. That one's September through May, and then the other one is October through April. The next gen one. Brian or B Aaby at slingshotgroup.org. You'll have all this stuff in that in your notes and stuff too. But love for people to reach out that way to talk to me and find out more about it. But slingshotgroup.org/cohorts. You can see any of the cohorts that we have. We have executive pastor one, worship one, and they're always coming up. So love to have somebody connect with us that way.
That's cool. I was with one of the churches I'm working with through Slingshot, went on Facebook for one of their staff and saw that one of their staff was in your last cohort because I saw you were friends on Facebook. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Let me scroll it. And sure enough, there was like a picture of your last cohort wrapping. And then my friend, who's an executive pastor, is doing the executive pastor one with Monty.
Sweet.
And I saw he just posted to invite some people to it. Man, coaching is big. I've been in so many groups, and we do some coaching with Ministry Boost every year. And you're right. It's like the connections and the network is just awesome. There's people that were in groups 6 years ago, and because of something I knew about them, I can be like, oh, that guy used to do that camp where high schoolers actually lead the students and they do Bible camp during the day and this at night.
Yep.
Let me go ask him, right? Like I wouldn't have that, if it weren't for like a
lifelong
thing. So
literally lifelong friendships. We've had people these first 2 years speaking at each other's camps, and it's been awesome, man. It's so fun.
That's cool. All right, we'll link the article in the show notes, which also has a link to find your cohort, or they can email you there. Brian, thanks for taking time to talk about this, for writing that article, and for helping these pastors calm down a little bit and lower, realize good expectations for their student ministry. And hopefully student pastors listened and thought, okay, it's not just me. Like,
yeah, bigger things. Awesome.
Cool. Thanks
so much for doing what you do, Nick. Thanks, man.
See ya. Well, there you go. It was great to have Brian Aaby on, talk about what he's seeing there with high school ministry, how churches are responding to that, what churches should and shouldn't do when it comes to hiring staff. I forgot to mention in the intro that this podcast is now available on video. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you know that. But most of you are probably still listening because that's how it's been for 7 years. But this podcast will still be available in audio form. However, if you are like me, I've started to watch a lot more of my podcast on YouTube, and I'll still do other things, and I'm not always watching. But if a podcast I listen to regularly has a video option, I find myself doing that more and more on YouTube. So if you could, even if you're not going to watch it there, I'd appreciate you going to check it out. Hit subscribe. There'll be some episodes where we'll probably share some things with video. In fact, the next episode, we're going to share some pictures of a children's ministry environment with our guests that, I took when we were out there doing a coaching thing. So that won't happen every episode, but you're definitely going to check out the YouTube channel. Just go to youtube.com/Nick Blevins to check that out. Like I mentioned before, check out Clearstream for your text message solutions. And I'd really appreciate if you looked up volunteerplaybook.com. If you haven't purchased my new book about leading and recruiting volunteers, get that book, use it, hopefully to help you build the kind of volunteer culture that you want to build. Now, coming out of the conversation with Brian, a few action items that I thought about that you could take would be, one, to talk to some other student pastors, especially if you're a student ministry leader and you're dealing with declining numbers. You got to talk with other student ministry leaders so you don't feel like you're alone. You can easily feel like you're alone there. And this might even, if you're a leader, if you're a next gen pastor, if you Pass this on to your pastor, next gen pastor. Talk with other leaders because this isn't an isolated thing. So if your church is struggling there, you're not alone. I recently had a conversation with a very large church where their student ministry is not what they would want it to be percentage wise. You know, a lot of times you'll hear that number 10%. You know, if the church is a 500 person church, you want 10% of that, 50 in your student ministry. If you're a 10,000 person church, you'd want 1,000 students coming. Well, this church is larger than 10,000, and they don't have that. They probably have 4%. I don't even know if it's 4%. You know, they might be in the 3-4% range. And I reminded them that, yes, if I were on staff there, that wouldn't be okay with me. I'd want to figure out, are we reaching enough students? Are there students here we're not reaching? Because that's what matters most. But at the same time, don't be too concerned. The larger a church gets, you know, the more common it is to not have that 10% number. So, and you only know that by talking with other leaders. So do that. Prepare your leaders. Number 2, prepare your leaders to help teens. What can you do? Knowing what they're going through, how their brain has developed through that, what that's going to leave them with, like Brian and I talked about. How can you help your leaders help your students? I think of my friend Will and Dr. Chenway's book, Seen, and then their new book, Beyond the Spiral. Both of those would be great resources for you to put in the hands of leaders, things like that, so that they're going in knowing what we talked about in this episode, and they can help students the most. And then third, we talked about focusing on smaller groups and relationships. So how can you do that? Create smaller, you know, more relational context for students as they're getting their way back to what maybe you had in place before, which you remember, but they may not. So those are 3 things that you can do coming out of this episode that I thought about. Check out the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 284 or in the description below if you're watching on YouTube. We'll be back next week with an interview about kids ministry. Like I mentioned, if you watch on YouTube, you'll get to see some pictures of the environments as we talk about my experience there, touring their ministry. We had some coaching groups that we had there at their church and learned a lot, some innovative things they're doing in children's ministry. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that. And I'll catch you in the next episode of the Family Ministry Podcast.